this conversation with others who might not be able to join us today. So Kathomi is a psychotherapist, researcher, academic and consultant. So I've asked Kathomi to give a little potted history, and there's a rich history here about her background and how she came to be a senior lecturer academic in the University of Southern Cross. That's the one, yeah. Okay. Located in Northern Rivers. So Northern Rivers of New South Wales, that is, but also has campuses elsewhere.
Yeah, I'm actually based in Gold Coast, but currently
based in the Gold Coast. Yeah, and she's been forbidden to talk about what she does on the weekends, given most of us are in lockdown. All right, so we're going to have that conversation.
Not that there is anything that happened, but okay, wouldn't say
not that anything amazing happened this weekend.
Yeah.
Oh, terrific. So, Kathomi, would you mind giving us a little potted history about how you came to be an academic?
Yeah, sure. So, first of all, thank you, everybody. It's so good to see all your faces. And Wendy has given me a little bit of a spiel about your backgrounds and the e-connecting forum that you've been doing every month. So that's lovely, and it's good to connect with you. So I came to Australia 8.5 years ago. It feels like a long time ago, but every time I say it's 8 years, it almost doesn't feel real because it feels like I've been here longer. And during that time, I came to Australia as a student. I was sponsored by a very generous Melbourneian who brought me over here to study. And she sponsored me to study my degree in psychotherapy. And then afterwards, we became really good friends. And she said, I'm not ready for you to leave. And she said, well, would you like to study a PhD? And she just said, yeah, okay, you find a school and I'll find the money. That is how the conversation went.
Yeah.
And I said, you don't get it. It's very expensive. It's almost $100,000 to study a PhD as an international student. And she said, it's just money, darling. So anyway, I went to school not feeling a lot of pressure, you know, from this woman's generosity. So that's how I came to be. I did my master's and then I did my PhD, and still very close relationship and friendship with Gwen, who brought me here and supported me. And then shortly after my PhD, I was shortlisted for, successful for quite a few jobs. And I came to Gold Coast because I'm not allowed to talk about the sunshine, but really it was about the sunshine. And, some of the things that they were offering me as part of that gig as well. So 8 years on, it feels a bit surreal. 8 years on, moving from Kenya into, going into academia and going into consultancy and my own therapy practice. Feels like a lot has been going on. That's why I say I feel it's been a long time, but really it isn't. So currently I am a senior academic at Southern Cross University, and mostly my area of research is in trauma. My PhD was on childbirth trauma, but let's just not talk about that today. It's just traumatized me enough just reading about it.
Yeah.
So I've extended my other areas of trauma into racial trauma and cultural trauma. And also trauma experienced by children who've been removed from their original homes.
Great. Thank you so much. That's a really nice potted history. And of course, there's a lot of textural layers to all of that. And maybe we'll get a chance when you're next in Melbourne to bring the group together in a social setting where we can delve into that. Wouldn't that be great? Wouldn't that be great? Look, we know, the reality on workplace diversity is that culture is one of those elements. Culture, ethnicity and race is highly underrepresented when you consider the population at large. 30% of Australians are first generation Australians, so that they're born overseas. So that brings a rich tapestry to the the cultural environment that we're operating in, but then layer that with second generation with at least one parent born overseas, and you're up around 40 to 50%. And yet, sadly, if we look to our leadership in this country, whether that be in the political sphere or whether it be in leadership in organisations, there's a dearth, it's a gap, that there is clearly some barriers for individuals, no matter how long they've been in this country, whether it's 20, 30 or 40 years, we still haven't seen the pattern of our cultural rich tapestry reflected in leaders and decision makers in organisations. So that's really brought us together to talk about, just what's happening, what are some of the things that we as influencers in our organisations might be able to do to advance the opportunities for individuals. Because I think what we've got to establish here is that it has nothing to do with competence or merit. There are other more systemic barriers at play that we haven't surfaced, we haven't named, and that's where our conversation is likely to go today. So, Kathomi, could you start us with, and I'm trying to weave in all of your fabulous questions. Kathomi and I were blown away by the richness of your questions in putting together today's program. So, and I've said to all of you, if I don't get it and nail it as weaving it into the flow of today's session, please, we want to allocate some time at the end, come back and really give us that laser question that you're looking to have an answer on today. So I wanted to really start with, the big elephant in the room is what's happening in America, but also what's happening in Australia and the Black Lives Matter movement. We recognise that when that protest began, it was really a call to address things that had not been taken seriously, whether it be loss of Indigenous persons in custody or the indiscriminate shooting of people of a racial profile in the community. And you responded to that outcry, Kathomi, with some very practical ways, because you recognised that Black people in Australia were saying that the silence in their workplaces was harmful. The silence itself was harmful. So by bringing these professional women, it happened to be, so there's an intersectional lens to this, so it's not only race, but it's women as well. Bringing professional women of colour together in a network to support each other was cathartic for you, but also for the members themselves. Can you tell us a little about what you found from bringing together these groups and what they found was supportive in their organisations?
Thanks, Wendy. I think the first protests, surrounding the Black Lives Matter started around June, following the death of the murder of George Floyd. And we started to see follow-on protests in Australia shortly after as well. And what I was feeling particularly around that time was this collective grief. I know it didn't happen to me, it didn't happen to a person that I knew, didn't happen to anybody in particular really that I know personally. But I think sometimes that is what collective grief is about. You're experiencing grief because it follows on from something that happens to people who look like you or are profiled because of the color that you wear yourself. So when I was listening to all these conversations from Black people online or in my own personal life, was just this collective trauma of how do we address this? How can we have conversations with our own children about what they are observing in the world? And the fatigue as well of constantly have to rehash these conversations of trauma and watching other Black people being killed, on the street and what it was doing to them personally. So here is where the context of racial trauma and racial battle fatigue, I know it's not a word that we use a lot, but it's called racial battle fatigue, where you're constantly exhausted by having to deal with, talk about, contextualize, make sense of little acts of racism in your everyday life, and these big ones which are ending up costing people's lives as they mind their own business in their day-to-day lives. So that is what racial battle fatigue is. And as I had conversations in my own networks, people are saying, I'm exhausted, I'm drained, I don't know what to do, I've been crying since the protest started. So I brought together, people were writing to me saying, what should we do? Should I talk to my HR manager about some time off, or what should I do? So I brought together this professional group of women, of Black women and other women of color, particularly Black women, in a forum. And it was very, very successful. I didn't expect a lot of people to show up, but I guess this was the gap that was there, and I brought them together. And I remember our first Zoom meeting was just at the height of the protests. And the women told me that it was so good to finally sit in a place where it was an all Black space, so that they could cry, so that they could just say how overwhelmed they felt, so that they could just, feel angry and not feel judged by the world by being angry and showing emotion. And it was a very healing session. But also some of the things that came from that session, I said, what's working for you in your workplace? What is your organization getting right, so that we can have conversations about those? And yes, 90% of the organizations really didn't get it right, because the response was neutral, or silence around the conversation. There was just this complete silence around the fact that we were in the middle of a civil rights movement that was happening globally, I know a lot of time when people saying, I wonder how it must have been to be alive in the 60s during the civil rights movement. Well, we are in another one. We are right in it. And how we are acting right now, and the responses and the choices we're making, is actually what's going to go into the history books, just like we read about from 50 years ago. So the women were saying there's so much silence, and I'm getting so hurt by it. I haven't even as much as received a call, an email, a text from any of my colleagues saying, how you doing, how you holding up, or something like that. So the way that silence was interpreted is, these Black lives matter. These Black lives do not matter enough to warrant a response from either my organization or from management or from HR. And there was a lot of hurt about that. I cannot stress enough how much that came through in that session about, I wish my HR manager, I wish my organization reached out to me and saying, how are you holding up at this time? It's difficult, you want a day off. And then there was the 10% of the organizations that got it right. And I say, tell us what they did that made a difference for you during this time. And it was, my HR manager called me personally and said, how are you holding up? It must be really tough for you, think about taking some personal day off, remember we've got the EAP program. If you'd like to access that, let me know how I can help. Or do you want to have a coffee? Do you want to have a Zoom meeting? And it wasn't necessarily even to talk about Black Lives Matter. It was, I'm holding space for you right now because I know you're overwhelmed and might be intimidated to ask for help. So there were some organizations where the team leaders or the managers actually made that personal effort to connect. And particularly for managers who felt they couldn't make a public statement, either because of the nature of their work or feeling like it would be divisive or something like that. But then they still made the individual effort to connect with people they knew would be personally impacted by what was happening globally. I know my work, did a couple of things, I got a, email from the dean saying, I hope you're holding okay, I hope you're okay. you know, take 2 days off if you need, let me know what else I can do. And I think that showed that my manager, my dean, was leading with the heart rather than just overly relying on the policy to just determine what was essentially a very emotional issue. So silence doesn't help. It perpetuates the idea that it is not worth talking about and it is not worth responding to. So I'll be interested to hear from you how your organizations navigated that tricky time.
Yeah, well, let's ask people. What were some of the, responses and measures that you put in place? Is there anyone can pinpoint anything that they've done themselves?
I'd be, just before we go into that, because I'm probably devoid of any great action there, so I'll be the first to hold up my hand. I don't actually have anybody that would be within that target group, if you like. But I think what's really difficult, and it's funny because when I was at the RFDS, Wendy, you'll know we had an Indigenous group come to talk to the organisation to try and educate us about, how to approach and how to embrace Indigenous concepts within our organisation. And I guess it was trying to develop a level of confidence for those who are not from certain backgrounds. But what I found interesting when you were talking then is I feel like we have grown up in this world where it's almost been impressed upon us not to call out difference, that everybody is the same. And for us to, I feel a bit like if I reached out to somebody because of the color of their skin, to see how they're doing in response to that, I am targeting that person as someone who is different to me. And I guess with disability, with color of our skin and everything else, it almost feels scary to do that. We're not comfortable to manage that conversation for fear that we could get someone saying, why are you ringing me and not that?
Why are you ringing me? And thank you so much for saying that, because I really get that and I get asked that a lot. But it is not possible not to see color. Yeah. We're here all today and we can all acknowledge I'm a Black woman. There's no point assuming I'm not because I am. And one of the things that I talk about a lot, particularly when I work with parents who are trying to raise more racially conscious children, is I say, please do not ask your kids to be colorblind. It confuses children. They see the difference. They want to engage with it. They want to be curious, because saying, I do not see your color, I do not see you are Black, actually erases all the experiences that I go through because I'm Black. And it's the same as saying, I don't see you're a woman. Actually, there are some experiences that we go through uniquely because we are women, either in the workplace or in our personal lives or things like that. Because race, just like gender, is an intersection that brings with it some unique experiences that if you're not of that color, you will be cushioned and you wouldn't have to experience it. And it's the same with gender as well. So thanks for bringing that up.
Yeah.
And I can assure you, if you reach out to a person and say, I'm just checking that you're okay during this time, it will be totally appropriate. And we are now moving away from this idea that everybody is the same. Well, actually, the reason we are protesting on the street is because our systems and structures are showing us that actually everybody is not being treated the same. And that's an acknowledgement of that, not a targeting of that person, So it's good to be sensitive about that. And I think it's really good that we're aware about that. But I think it's reaching out and saying, I acknowledge that this is a difficult time. And this is actually a uniquely racial experience. You're not targeting them, you're holding their space while they go through that unique experience. And there's a difference with that. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. And I understand that we're talking about race here today. It may not be the same if we were calling out diversity that comes with disability, you know, because there's a strong preference for somebody who's less able to be, you know, not viewed in any way different because they've handled their abilities or their, you know, changing abilities. That
yeah, absolutely.
And I think it also goes to some of the hallmarks around what constitutes an inclusive leader. And an inclusive leader has 5 elements that they are distinguished from as opposed to ordinary leaders. And one of them is being open and curious, and the other is being identity aware. So aware of their own identity and the unique combinations of identities that others bring to the workplace. So have a look at what's on the Diversity Council of Australia website on that whole topic around inclusive leadership. Because once those organisations that have really strong practice in this area have high trust, and you are able to talk quite readily about unique attributes of each other, and rather than trying to, you know, homogenise everybody to be and pretend we're all the same. And it does take courage, it does take practice, but there are some techniques on that. Any other individuals want to speak on what they did specifically to the Black Lives Matter civil rights movement?
I'd be happy to share, Wendy.
Yeah.
So just in terms of Basketball Victoria, we put out a public statement of support, and I sort of mentioned to Wendy prior to this meeting that I've been sort of watching sport in general because it's really been taken up by the NBA players, you know, participating in not only protests but also financial support and things like that. So it's playing out quite visibly in sport in that players are taking action and holding organisations or their people that organise them to play, holding them to account that, you know, often these organisations like to use these players as their advertisement and things like that to show that they're an inclusive sport. But then to become silent on an issue like this is like flying in the face of that.
It's complete hypocrisy.
Yeah.
So
yeah, we put out a public statement talking all about our leagues and celebrating the participation and the contribution of players from these communities and Black communities, and saying that they deserve the same level of respect and opportunities and things like that, and that we want to create the most welcoming basketball environments free from discrimination. Yeah. What we've done is, I find that that's quite public and outwardly, but I would then also, we haven't made an internal statement, but in my mind, we're going to be doing some unconscious bias training with Wendy actually, and that's an element that I want to bring into that as well, to use the Black Lives Matter, because I know from staff that they have been contacted by people wanting to know what our position is, and also contacting us as well to say, you know, from HR, what are you going to say about this? And by doing that training internally, I think will be a real way of bringing that training to life and showing that it is really important and really relevant in today's world.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and I think it's about creating racial safety. I think it's for the people in your organization to go, I am seen, my experience is seen, I feel like I'm valued in this organization enough for my experience to actually be part of discourse. Because for a long time, it just hasn't been a part of anything that's considered in those decision making. So that's wonderful.
Mm-hmm. Following on from that, it might be relevant to talk about the notion of racial safety, Kathomi, and racial safety as it pertains to the workplace, and the sense of how workplaces can proactively engage in this conversation to shore up, you know, racial and cultural safety.
Yeah, and I think that follows on to what Melanie was asking about what is safe for me to talk about without, you know, feeling like I am putting the other person on the spot, you know, because they're Black, you know. And again, it is okay to call people Black, you know. I think we should be okay with that, you know, and not feel like we should shy away from naming, you know, how people are, because the experiences, particularly of a lot of Black people, are very layered with their race, you know, and a lot of people, including in America, they are now saying, we're not African Americans, we are Black, say we're Black, you know, and, you know, language is always changing to create what is safe for people in organizations and things like that. So I think, you know, questions like what Melanie is asking about, what is appropriate for me, you know, as a HR person to talk about in the context of this kind of conversations. And I think just the way you've asked is just the place to start. So if you've got Black colleagues or colleagues of color in your workplace and, you know, your head of HR, talk to them, say, can I have a coffee with you? I know that's what my boss did with me, you know, because I'm the only Black person in the entire department. And therefore, the experiences that I have that none of my other colleagues ever has in the workplace. And so that's where we started. We said, what is it that we can do to make sure that you belong here, that you're not feeling like you're constantly the only one, you know? And I didn't have answers at that time, but I remember going home and saying, God, that was very thoughtful. You know, the fact that they thought about doing that and reaching to talk to me about that, you know, that is a very thoughtful leader who acknowledged that my identity is part of how I experience my workplace. And to start with questions about how can we better support you to feel safer and to feel like you belong here. You know, so this follows on to my next thing, which is about when they do tell you what they need, don't gaslight them and say, oh, it's not that bad, you know, like it's really not that bad. We are very inclusive over here, and we even did this inclusive thing last time, and we even did a cultural training last time. Like, sit with that, whatever it is that they're saying would make them feel better, and be honest and say, we might not be able to do that, but we might be able to meet you here, you know, and have those honest conversations with them as well. The other thing is about, do all of you have EAP programs in your workplaces? Yeah, so how do you know if your EAP programs actually have therapists of color, you know, and people who actually are trained in the area of cultural safety or cultural sensitivity? I'll speak from my own personal experience. This is what I did this year. You know, when everything was happening and I felt quite overwhelmed, and my dean said, what can we do? And I said, actually, one of the things you can do is actually make it possible for me to access a therapist who actually understands what I'm going through right now.
Whether that be from a lived experience or whether that be from, you know, really in-depth knowledge.
Absolutely. So
yeah.
I need to feel safe when I go and say, I'm so angry about what's happening in the world, without feeling like that person would just look at me like the angry Black woman. You know, I need...
Which is a stereotype.
Which is a stereotype that is so dominant and diverse. And the first thing that they said was, sure, do you have someone in mind? And I said, yeah, I can look around. And when I identified someone I felt could hold exactly what I was feeling at that time, I went back and I said, I think I've identified someone I would like to have my 6 sessions with. And they said, yes, they're not part of our EAP program, but we will accommodate that. And I think it's just about acknowledging that even though we might have access to therapists or counselors, not all counselors can hold different traumas the same way. You know, like some people are trained in different areas. So have a look at how diverse your EAP program is, you know, whether your colleagues there have access to people who can understand, and make that quite explicit even in your hiring process, that our EAP program is culturally safe and we have access to people who can provide these services should they ever be needed. Right now, I know from personal experience, I can't go to work for an organization that does not have a cultural safety framework because workplaces can be very traumatizing, as you all might be aware from different perspectives. So one of the questions that I always ask in interview is, what's your cultural safety guideline? You know, I need to know that I can feel safe here. And that's one of the things that probably is very easy to do within your roles. It's just scout that place and see whether you might be able to make some different decisions or support some different decisions. Wendy, did you have anything to add there? Or?
Well, it's more of a question. You know, the EAP is one thing, but what else would sit within a cultural safety framework for an organisation?
Recruitment processes, you know, so, and I know you're probably all aware of this, about the idea that merit is loaded with bias, and, you know, research has shown that over and over again, that the people who tend to be seen as meritorious are likely people who are from dominant cultural groups anyway. So how do we incorporate and recruit people who are not likely to meet those meritorious guidelines because they're systemically disadvantaged from accessing that social capital? So, you know, some of the things that I tell HR managers, even in your recruitment processes, I avoid questions like, you know, why did you leave your last job? You know, and
why is that? Why is that a sensitive question? Because I'd imagine, you know, it's in the repertoire of many hiring managers.
That's a common question. It's because most of the Black women I've worked with who are leaving their workplaces are leaving because of racial microaggressions and racial trauma and racism at work. And so when they're put on the spot in an interview, they can't bring up race because it tends to make people feel defensive. And so it's...
You mean the panel members?
The panel members and the recruiting members, you know, there's always this idea that race is a very triggering and difficult topic to talk about. So most of them feel kind of trapped with that question because they don't want to lie. But also at the same time, they also want to acknowledge that this is important to me, that I'm coming to a place that is safe for me to work in.
Yeah,
you know.
Terrific. So we had a question from one of our members. How can we assess whether an organisation has cultural maturity to tackle inclusion for people of colour? And how do we get the leaders to recognise its immaturity in that regard?
I loved that question. And the reason why I love that question is because look around your organization. How many diverse faces do you see? You know, and how many people end up being hired in your workplace, you know, and how many people are, you know, are excluded within your organization, either consciously or unconsciously, because this is how unconscious bias actually works. You know, we think we make decisions that are based on merit, but actually they're just a confirmation of our bias. So look around your organization, and I'm just going to put this bluntly. How white is your organization? How white is your HR team? And how white is your leadership executive team? That is the answer number one to how culturally mature are we in this workplace. Secondly, you know, after you answer that question is, what are your relationships? If you don't have that in your organization, do you have relationships with people of color who can come and help you to develop these strategies? And you be willing to actually take them on board. You know, I can't count the number of times I've helped organizations, you know, draft this and then they go, it's too hard. It's too hard. We don't know what to do. We don't know what to do because there's a block there about it. So, and
would you say that really, you know, aspiration without leadership buy-in is not going to advance the cause of diversity, or for that matter, inclusion, very far?
Yeah. And for me, I always think conversations. I think there's one member who asked about, do diversity trainings actually work? And I think this is related as well. Do they formulate long-lasting change? And I would say To some extent, yes, but I'll tell you why we've been stuck at inclusion for so long, because we don't move post-inclusion to belonging. It is very easy for people to be included. You know, I'm included, you know, everybody is included. We live in a very inclusive society, actually, particularly in Australia, which is quite multicultural. But every time you talk to people from these minoritized backgrounds, they say, I don't feel like I belong. It's because we've been stuck very long in the diversity and inclusion space and not developed specific strategies to how to foster belonging. I feel like I need to share something here.
Oh,
Wendy, just give me a minute.
okay.
And I'll just share it with the group, because when I was reading it, could you, are we sharing?
Oh, I might need to give you control rights.
Because I just wanted to show the group what I actually mean by moving from inclusion to, hang on a second.
Here we go.
Okay.
See if that works for you.
It does.
Great.
So here we go. Tell me if you can see that.
Not yet.
Oh, that's because I haven't clicked share. Okay.
Yeah.
So can you see that?
Sure. Yes.
So if you look at those red dots there, of course, this is where we are coming from. That's our history, you know, exclusion and segregation and separation. And then we've kind of integrated a little bit, and now we are in this third box, which is inclusion. But the box that's missing there is actually belonging, because it is possible for people to be included and not feel like they necessarily belong. And for me, this is where the work on racial safety, cultural safety, is the work that actually fosters belonging. Yeah. Tell me if that makes sense to you guys.
Yeah, I think it does, because I've got a similar graphic that I've developed for some of my poster and pledge campaigns, and that inclusion piece, while it looks to be kind of binary up to from exclusion through to separation, and I've called that, you know, acceptance, but, you know, as long as you're a people of colour are reserved to the IT department, everyone feels good that they've got diversity, because we expect to see people of colour in the dev team, in the IT team. But when you've got multiple colours working, you've got belonging, you've got inclusion at that advanced stage, because it's not binary anymore with them and us. It's about the thems and the us's can be any colour they want.
Yeah, absolutely. And not hiring one black person and say, oh, we're very inclusive. Look at Kathomi. We hire black people here in this university because we've got the one person who can kind of validate our idea that we are not an all-white organization.
Yeah.
So, and because there's also, you know, the burden of being the only one. And I don't know whether you've experienced this as women as well, when you're the only female person on a board member or on a board committee or on the table. It can feel quite overwhelming, and this pressure of feeling like you carry a whole gender with you or a whole race with you within that context. So 1 is lonely, 2 is a bit okay, 3 starts to create the sense that I'm not the only one. And so think about those numbers as well and how they change experiences for people of other races in your workplace.
Indeed, I think that's a really important point. They say the critical point is 3 on any board, to ensure that there is perceptions are debunked where a woman must think a particular way. To have 3, you will see that women can think very differently on a range of topics, and you need a critical mass of that diversity within that gender space in particular, and that would be the same for people of colour as well. I want to ask the next question, which is to think about, you know, what's your experience with cultural competence training and what that is likely to deliver in terms of a change of the workplace culture, that sense of belonging?
So I don't do cultural competency anymore. I just don't think they work. And Wendy, I think we've had conversations about, problematizing cultural competency as opposed to cultural safety, and cultural belonging and cultural sensitivity. So the reason why I have some resistance towards competence is that, is it really possible for us to be competent in someone else's culture? I think for a long time in the workplaces that I've been, it's mostly a tick box thing. Yes, I did that training for half a day, and then, that one Black person came and talked to us for one a day. Now I'm culturally competent to be able to do that. And I know that it's not really humanly possible to really be competent in other people's complexities of their culture. But what we can do is create a place and a space in the workplace that's actually safe for them to express their, their culture and feel safe enough within that environment to be who they are and to work with that as well. So, and I think that is why cultural competence has its problems. But I think, Wendy, we've been talking about how that's now shifting in the workplace more into cultural safety, because we're recognizing competency is not enough. The skill in and of itself is not enough. How do we then move the skill into action to make sure that people are feeling safe and belong in the workplace? Does that make sense, the difference between competency and safety? Yeah, they are two different things.
Yeah. So how would you recommend an organisation that's fairly immature on its journey in terms of cultural diversity? What are some of the first steps that they can take?
So first of all, look at your policy around diversity and your guidelines about that, and see what the language is and what that means for your organization. And secondly, probably work hand in hand with people who are trained in this area to start helping your organization develop culturally safe guidelines with which to apply, in your workplace. So if you're thinking about what can I do differently in my workplace, I always tell people this all the time. This work is personal. Yes, we are professionals in the workplace, but this work has got to feel personal. What am I personally invested in here, so that I can actually make a difference for other people who are working here? And we can't do cultural safety trainings if we ourselves are struggling with our own bias, with our own prejudice, with our own, lack of engagement in it. So I always say it starts from the top. That's where trees start to rot, and that is where we see them starting to flourish, if everything is going right. So if the managers and the executives are getting it right, I was telling Wendy today, it actually changes the dynamic of a workplace completely. If employees start to get a sense that, they won't care about that, you go and report and see that nothing will happen. It gives people permission to actually behave in this kind of ways, to, engage in microaggressions at work, because they know the top leadership is also quite disengaged from that conversation as well. Does anybody want to add anything about that, about what they're doing, or what?
Particularly around what strategies they're deploying to get leader buy-in to the concept.
Mm-hmm. Be interested to hear.
I feel like unconscious bias training is probably a great place to start, because it allows you to just, in the raw context, just uncover any of those issues. That is probably a good way of illustrating it. I think, just if I can just put a quick personal lens on it, I've got the challenge of trying to infiltrate a culture. We've got probably a 60% Chinese culture, that trying to infiltrate a culture to open up to other cultures is especially hard, because they're incredibly close. Their business ethics, their business cultures are very, very different, and they're very closed to other cultures. So it's almost a double whammy of trying to...
And finding the sweet levers that will influence their mental shifts. I think that's key. And most leaders are interested in three things. They're interested in productivity, they're interested in innovation, they're interested in growth. So it's building that business case around mobilising and using those as leverages are the kinds of things that I know resonate with executives. It's a different approach than the moral right. You know, it's morally right to do this. That doesn't really engage them. The things that keep them awake at night are around productivity, innovation and growth. And are they reflective of the whole customer base in understanding how they might get that productivity and in particular how they might get that innovation? I think that's a key driver that transcends all of the profiling of what the current composition of the leadership might look like. You know, and sometimes it's a lost cause, Melanie, you know? Sometimes it's so deeply entrenched that, you know, the only thing you have available to you is to move yourself. If it's an important matter for you, to move yourself out of those scenarios. And that happens. Sometimes there's just no inroad into the leadership mindset.
Yeah.
And if there's not a burning platform for change, you know.
And I think also maybe being a psychotherapist and my training being very relationship focused, you know, I see the relationship as the edge, you know, as the platform through which any change can occur. If there is no trust, if I don't feel like you're on my side, if I don't feel like I can trust our engagement and our interaction, I'm very rarely going to just open myself. You know, there's an old saying that says, "Do not cast your emotions to swines." You know, it's true, and I, you know, you only do that and open up yourself where there's been deep trust, deep relationship that has been entrenched. And so, even in the case of race, when I see this huge divide between white and black, and you know, I go, the place to start is within a trusting relationship and a willingness to be able to do the work together. And when the trust is gotten right within the context of a relationship, I always feel even the hardest of hearts are actually softened within that engagement. But are we willing to be able to do that work to get us there?
Yeah. Terrific. Opening it up now to general questions from the floor. We may not have covered the question you sent through, so here's your opportunity.
If I can jump in again, Kathomi, I must admit I feel a bit the same as Melanie in terms of it can feel a bit like you're walking on eggshells in making sure that you're approaching people in the right way and speaking to them in the right way to not make matters worse, for instance. And I'm really interested in the point that you raised around, you know, it's okay to call people black and not to be colourblind. And I'm just wondering, in terms of educating ourselves, where would you suggest in terms of going to a place where we can look into that research and make sure we're using the right language? Because, you know, even myself, my husband's South African, and, you know, I would refer to him as mixed race, and now I'm not even sure if I'm referring to my own husband in the right way. Do you know what I mean? Like,
Yeah.
and if I find that difficult when I've got such a personal relationship, I can just imagine how other people who aren't exposed to that might feel.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's okay to feel some trepidation, and I think to see you engaging with, I don't know whether trepidation is the right word, with care, I think that's good, because for a long time there hasn't been care in these conversations. For a long time there's been a lot of harm that has been caused through language. Yeah. So to see people take a step back and go, maybe I shouldn't say that, I think that's a good thing. So embrace that without feeling like you need to run away from it. The fact that you're thinking about, oh, is this appropriate, is wonderful, because just a decade or 2 decades ago, we were not there.
It's a sign of progress.
I think it's a sign of progress, and instead of feeling guilt or wondering, I think you go, oh, that's a wonderful thing that I'm reflecting on it. The second thing is to always ask. I mean, I can't speak for all Black people, but you know, having done research around race for, you know, almost a decade, I know there are always some majorly preferred terms, and I know particularly for Black people, they just prefer to be called Black. particularly because that forces people to acknowledge that with Blackness comes other unique experiences that need to be recognized as. But having said that, like Melanie was trying to explain, I think people are different. You might like people who just don't like it. And I think this is where relationships are really important, because if you've never spoken to your Black colleague before or employee before, and then from the blue, you just go, hey, as a Black person, I really want to hear what you have to say. I think it's the relationship that cements, those conversations. And so I think the challenge for all of us is to ask ourselves, how many Black people do we have in our social circles? How many Black people come for dinner in your home? Because that is where this intimacy and these conversations actually start. How many Black kids do your friends make at school, and how many people are surrounded by diversity, not just as a concept, but from that intimate personal place? So I think to answer that question, I think it's coming to safety, and safety is predicated by relationship. And I think there's so many white women who I'm very, very, very close with, who this conversation has now become normal. They feel they can ask me, they feel they can refer, and I can refer some things with them because we've established a place in our relationship where it is safe to do so. And that is not just personal relationships, those are also professional relationship. I think I gave the story of my dean because we share a very collegial relationship, feeling safe enough to come to me and say, hey, what can I do, within the context of your workplace? So, I know that's a bit vague, but it's where the work is, and the work is in the relationship to be able to create a safe place where it's okay to ask and to actually engage with that other person from a place of not trepidation, but also from a place of care. But embrace the care at the beginning.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you so much. We've got time for perhaps one more question, but I wanted to make two statements in response to questions that we received from the members. One was around, as a parent, what are some of the best ways to create greater awareness of cultural diversity and inclusion in our children? And I think Kathomi sort of somewhat answered that by bring them into our homes as one thing. But you've also written a piece for SBS, videoed it. Was that right, Kathomi? And she's happy to share that link with us. So I'll put that in our LinkedIn group so that we can delve into that at our own pace. The other was a question of how do we, it's one thing to recruit women, but how do we target, what's the best way to target cultural diversity in our recruitment practices? And I just wanted to share a fabulous find. In the LinkedIn networks that are doing the rounds, I came across one group called Professional Migrant Women. And I wonder if that might be something that you join and follow so that it gives you access to promoting roles and opportunities onto a job board that no doubt they will have as part of their infrastructure. And that's just one. So there are likely to be many more. We just have to look for them in non-obvious places or not in our standard places that we go to for our recruitment activities.
And we have this relationship now, and this is why the power of relationship is so important. Because I'm in your network now, if you need to recruit that way, and I think these professional networks are really important. If you have a job opening or whatever, and you can forward it to me, and I have broader networks of other people who are diverse, I can always help to spread this word. It's the relationship that helps us to go. Yeah.
Terrific. Do we have that one last question, or I'll hand it over to Justine to do a vote of thanks, because I know we've just clocked 1:30. By all means, stay on after, if Kathomi can stay on for another 5 or 10 minutes, if you feel like to ask that question. But can I ask Justine to say thanks to our speaker today?
Yeah, thanks very much, Kathomi. I just wanted to, thank you on behalf of the group, and I've been madly scribbling down notes as you've been talking today. I think that you've given us some really good practical insights to think about, and I think one of the points that really drove home with me was around cultural competency. It's not really something that you can expect to have, but creating cultural safety is sort of a more realistic goal to have, and I think that's something that is really important for us to do in our organisations. And like you say, relationships in all organisations are important, and using that as the lever to create that cultural safety is how we will probably achieve that. So really appreciate your time, and it's been really good to meet you.
Thank you.
That's a great summary.
That's a terrific summary. I told you they were a pretty together group.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you all for joining in. If you want to stay on, by all means do so. We can have a few chats after. But thank you, and we'll see you in October.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Cheers to all. I'll stop the recording now.
Okay.